All right, so today I want to talk about cancel culture, and no, not the conservative, grifting, fake victimhood, outrage machine cancel culture, but actual cancel culture that does exist in the United States and that we have seen happen to a number of journalists and teachers as well that we are going to get into in this video. But in addition to that, we're going to be talking about some of these anti-BDS laws that have been enshrined in law across the United States and which are completely unconstitutional. So I want to get into this because we got a new story here from The Intercept, which is giving an example of what actual cancel culture looks like in this country. And this story is even more insane because it involves an actual Israeli government-sanctioned official who is getting involved in trying to get a teacher basically fired from their position and prevented from teaching a course on Israel and Palestine because of her pro-Palestine takes in the past. So here from The Intercept, Israeli diplomat pressured UNC to remove a teacher who criticized Israel. An Israeli consul general baselessly accused a graduate student of anti-Semitism and said she shouldn't teach a course on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So what actually happened here? Well, this August, Israeli consular officials in the southeast United States arranged meetings with the dean at UNC, basically University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, to discuss a graduate student teaching a course on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And according to two UNC professors with knowledge of the meetings who asked for anonymity for fear of retribution, the Israeli official accused the PhD student of anti-Semitism and said she was unfit to teach the course. The intervention by an Israeli government official, consul general to the southeastern United States, Anat Sultan Dadan, followed a pressure campaign by right-wing pro-Israel websites and an advocacy group to remove the graduate student, Kylie Broderick, from teaching the history department course called The Conflict Over Israel and Palestine. And the websites and pro-Israel advocacy groups pointed to postings that Broderick had made on Twitter that criticized Israel and Zionism and, without evidence, cited the postings as evidence of anti-Semitism. So this is the big conflict that we always get into when we discuss how people have a complete inability to separate criticisms of a government and criticisms of the actions of a state versus criticisms of an entire religion. Okay, so what were the actual tweets that they were mad about? Well, here's one example. Everyone at UNC has a responsibility to step up for Palestinians and Palestine. Start following #BDS immediately. Boycott Israeli products. Investigate UNC's investments. Agitate in your departments for Palestinian liberation. We will win when we do this together. And then she gives a guidebook on exactly what to do and how to be involved in this boycott. Okay, so first of all, this is absolutely no different. Okay, we're talking about boycott, divestment, and sanction. This is a strategy that worked in apartheid South Africa. That's where this strategy comes from. Okay. According to many human rights groups around the country, including Human Rights Watch, Israel is an apartheid state, okay? You go and look at their policies, you go and look at their laws and the unfair treatment, whether it's in their judicial treatment, whether it's treatment from their security forces, whether it's treatments in who is allowed to build houses and live where, who is allowed to drive on certain roads in Israel. Israel is an apartheid state, similar, while not in the same capacity, and there are many differences between them, but similar to how South African apartheid was operating, okay? So using BDS as a strategy is exactly what we should be doing in order to address apartheid in Israel, just as we used it as a strategy to address apartheid in South Africa. So if you are going to take a tweet like this, right, which is completely accurate in terms of identifying what the actual situation is and how Palestinians have been oppressed by the state of Israel, if you are going to say that this is evidence of anti-Semitism, then you would have had to apply this exact same rule back under South African apartheid and said no U.S. teachers or no U.S. companies are allowed to engage with boycott, divestment, and sanctions of apartheid South Africa. And not only that, but teachers should not even, let's say, be able to teach about Nelson Mandela. That is the equivalent of what you are saying if you are saying that this tweet is evidence that a teacher should not be allowed to teach a class on Israel and Palestine, okay? It's no different than these laws that we have seen coming out of conservative states where they say you are no longer allowed to teach that the KKK was inherently immoral, okay? That's actually in laws that have been passed around the United States, is conservatives are trying to basically create this false sense of neutrality in a situation that is not neutral, okay? The KKK is objectively bad. Apartheid is objectively bad, right? And so we should be able to say these things openly without being criticized, or not without being criticized, everybody should be open to criticism, but without being removed from our jobs for accurately pointing out what the situation is. So this is the tweet that they were mad at and that they called anti-Semitic. Okay, anti-Semitic. You show me exactly where the anti-Semitism in this tweet is. There's no mention of Judaism as a religion. There's no mention of the Jewish people as an ethnicity. Okay, there's no mention of any of that. It is simply criticizing the state of Israel for their actions as a government, as a state. Okay, so there's a complete difference there that many people who are very pro-Zionist use or basically ignore in order to call people anti-Semitic and try to get them fired from their positions. So they continue here giving some of the details. So in addition to the intervention by the Israeli government, the school faced pressure from a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, the two UNC professors told The Intercept. And the professor said that Representative Kathy Manning, a Democrat from North Carolina, also met with the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences to exert pressure over, so not even just an Israeli diplomat, an official Israeli government official, okay? Not even just that, but a U.S. congressperson is going to the dean of this school to try to get this teacher fired for this. Okay, for calling out that we should use the strategy, the effective strategy of BDS against an apartheid state. Okay, that's where we're at right now. And they continue saying, quote, "It is not a new phenomenon where outside parties have tried to stifle academic freedom on this subject," said Broderick. "But these people have never seen me teach. They've never seen past evaluations, which have said that I treat students fairly, and thus have no right to dictate what I say inside the classroom." And they continue saying that, and she's absolutely right on that, but they continue saying Israel-Palestine has become one of the most politicized areas of academia, with periodic firings of professors, prosecutions of students, and even the maintenance of a public blacklist, helping to impose an atmosphere of fear and self-censorship over the topic. Okay, so again, this is what cancel culture actually looks like. This is what it looks like when you are using the law and you are using foreign fucking diplomats and you are using members of Congress in order to silence free speech. This is exactly what it looks like. And even by that standard, the intervention of the Israeli government officials directly with an American university over the teaching of a course represents a troubling new threat to academic freedom. And she continues saying, quote, "I think that a representative of a foreign government attempting to police an academic class is, in the first place, ridiculous and an obvious overreaction to what is essentially an issue that started on Twitter," again, calling back to those tweets. And she continues saying that, "I also think it is strange that the Israeli consulate general was granted an audience. If this was a class on Hungary or Australia, would the university have permitted the attempted interference of a foreign government? The fact that this meeting happened at all is clearly a threat to academic freedom." She's absolutely 100% right. And as she points down here, she makes a comparison to Iran, but she's 100% right. There's no difference, right? Could you imagine if some teacher was teaching about Middle East affairs and they're talking about Iran, and then suddenly some Iranian diplomat is showing up at the school to try to get them fired for criticizing Iran, or saying that they are Islamophobic for criticizing the government of Saudi Arabia or Iran? It would be completely ridiculous. And that's exactly as ridiculous as it is to say that it's anti-Semitic to criticize the government of Israel. It's completely absurd, and it's honestly dangerous because, again, this is what silencing free speech actually looks like, okay? Do you think whoever's going to take her place in teaching this course is going to be willing to give Palestinians a fair shake? No, of course they're not, because they're terrified of these massively influential pro-Zionist lobbying groups and the actual Israeli government itself and members of Congress, that they're going to come breathing down their neck and try to get them fired if they say something wrong or criticize Israel in a way that they don't see fit. So it's completely ridiculous, and this is what an actual threat to free speech looks like. And we have multiple other examples. If you remember, pretty recently, the AP fired one of their journalists, Emily Wilder, for past pro-Palestinian tweets. And I'm going to spare you the details on a lot of this, but it was completely ridiculous, okay? This is a person, Emily Wilder, who is a fantastic journalist, but she wasn't even covering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So you couldn't even say like, oh, she clearly has a bias towards Palestinians, therefore she shouldn't be allowed to cover Israel and Palestine. No, she was not even covering foreign policy in any way, okay? So they fired this person for having past pro-Palestinian tweets, and then they didn't even say which of the tweets violated their policy. As you can see here, Wilder was fired last week after serving just 2 weeks on the job. The AP said in a series of Wilder's pro-Palestinian tweets violated its social media policy, although the AP has not said which tweets violated the policy. So they fired her basically because they were scared of public backlash. And this was, no joke, less than 2 weeks after the government of Israel, the state of Israel, blew up the AP building in Gaza, okay, during that massive bombing campaign where they also happened to kill dozens and dozens of innocent children and hundreds of innocent Palestinians in this bombing campaign. They also obliterated the AP building, okay, and said that Hamas was being harbored in this AP building, and the AP turns around and they're like, what the fuck are you talking about? We don't have any, there's no evidence that Hamas was in this building at all, and they blew up the fucking AP building in Gaza. And then 2 weeks later, the AP is so cucked to the government of Israel that they would fire one of their new journalists for simply having pro-Palestinian Palestinian tweets in the past. It's completely absurd, but this is exactly what US media is like when it comes to the issue of Israel and Palestine. Nobody has the balls to actually come out and define the situation as it is. And we have more examples here, okay? If you remember, Abby Martin, and this happens to be from my home state here in Georgia. So what's your honorarium? Sign an anti-BDS pledge first. So Abby Martin, who is a fantastic anti-imperialist journalist and filmmaker, as they point out, sued Georgia Southern University after she was prevented from speaking at a conference unless she agreed to refrain from boycotting Israel. So these are the anti-BDS laws that I'm talking about that are completely unconstitutional and absurd, okay? So basically, she was prevented from speaking at a public university because she would not sign an agreement, basically, that she would not agree with BDS, that she would not promote BDS during the duration of the contract. And so here's the actual law, just a quick summary of it. So this is a Georgia law that was passed in 2016. All right. So a bill to be entitled Act, okay, don't need to read this, Part 1 of Article 3 of Chapter 5 of Title 50 of the Official Code of Georgia annotated relating to the general authority, duties, and procedure relative to the state purchasing so as to prohibit the state, including all of its subdivisions and instrumentalities, from entering into certain contracts with an individual or company unless such contracts contain a certification that such individual or company does not presently conduct a boycott of Israel and will not conduct such a boycott for the duration of the contract. This is 100% unconstitutional, okay? This would not apply to any other government around the world. Could you imagine if a company or a private individual was to say, I'm going to boycott products that are made in, let's say, Saudi Arabia, for example? Not that Saudi Arabia has that many exports or anything like that, but just as a hypothetical, could you imagine if somebody were to say, I'm going to boycott Saudi Arabia, and then the state of Georgia, the actual state, the government body, is saying, well, no longer, you can't do anything with the government anymore because you violated one of our allies' feelings, basically. You have hurt their feelings. That's essentially what we are talking about right now. We are talking about any criticism of Israel being, one, conflated with anti-Semitism, and then two, you being actually prevented from speaking publicly because of this state law, which is, again, completely unconstitutional and a absolute violation of free speech. And Abby Martin did sue. And even though courts have found this to be completely unconstitutional, it doesn't really matter because they're still being enforced. But listen, these laws are completely unconstitutional. This is what actual cancel culture looks like in the United States, okay? It is people not being able to speak up for Palestinian rights. It is signing anti-BDS laws that prevent people from exercising their free speech and exercising a strategy in BDS that was actually effective in challenging South African apartheid, okay? It's the exact same goddamn situation that we have right now. It's completely ridiculous. And if conservatives ever complain about being canceled because they're being silenced on Twitter or whatever the fuck, bring up examples like this, because this is exactly what cancel culture actually looks like. Other examples we could look to would be Julian Assange or Edward Snowden, who are literally in exile and facing jail time for exposing the crimes of the US empire. So how can we pretend to have free speech in this country? How can we pretend to care about the First Amendment if this is not something that we are addressing?